The first one is the big one, which has sort of happened third day of testing as we're at now, and Mercedes with their front suspension. Now, we kind of had some clues that they were going to play about with this from the launch renders, but what they've done is they've changed what we describe as the anti-dive setup on the front suspension. So the top wishbone, rather than normally they would be kind of horizontal, in the anti-dive setup, they're angled downwards. Now, Mercedes launched with the car with quite a bit of anti-dive set up in the suspension, but now what they've done is they've taken that top wishbone off, put a new one on with a lower mountain, and it's even more angled. So you'll get an even bigger anti-dive effect and an even bigger aerodynamic downwash effect, both of which are important. And I don't know which is more important in these current suspension setups, whether it's geometry or aerodynamics, but all the same, it's quite unusual for a team to have such a big change. Now, historically, if you look at any suspension system on a race car, particularly maybe not so much with Formula One nowadays, but there's always been a small degree of adjustment that you could change the anti-dive by maybe, 10, 20 millimeters, which isn't unusual. It's quite difficult to do with carbon fiber wishbones because you actually have to have a separately molded wishbone because you can't just kind of bend them like you can with steel wishbones. But what Mercedes have done, have moved it not by millimeters, but by tens of millimeters, probably maybe 30, 40 millimeters, moving that top wishbone angled downwards even bigger, which means obviously that is again another wishbone. And just kind of raises the question is, why are they doing this? Well, this is obviously something that was designed into the car because you've got to have two structural mounts for the suspension arm. Plus, we had a little precursor of this. Mercedes launched some CGI renders of their car when the car was unveiled, and you actually saw a second ghosted wishbone in that position. So we kind of knew something may happen here, but still a little bit surprising to have such a big change. So why Mercedes choosing to go with two big variations in front suspension geometry? And I can only guess is this is going to be something that they'll choose per circuit. So, some circuits, maybe they don't need the anti-dive or the downwash effect, and they'll go for the slightly higher wishbone, and other ones, they'll play about with it. But it's not something that we've seen sort of historically, that level of change in a suspension system.
Well, if they are doing it from circuit to circuit, that suggests they know exactly what they're doing at any given moment. They're totally on top of the aero performance of the car. I'm being cynical, of course. But in reality, in your mind, what would constitute an anti-dive circuit and what would constitute a circuit where you don't want as much anti-dive? Are we talking about high-speed braking here or what?
That's anti-dive really only has a geometrical effect under braking. So yes, you would have to suspect that it's called circuits where there's heavy braking, but equally something that's matched with a relatively soft setup. So if you've got a stiff setup and you're braking, then the anti-dive has a slightly less effect. If you're running quite a soft setup on the springs, then it means that you're going to get dive, which affects your aerodynamics. So it's not as simple as just a circuit with heavy braking. It's going to be, the nature of the spring rates that they would run at that circuit, all bringing that in together. And I'm at this stage at a loss to kind of predict which circuits are more that than others, but something we'll give some thought to before the season starts.
Well, it sounds quite complicated, obviously, and you'd imagine that if any team was in a position to play around with that sort of complication, it would be Red Bull. But anyway, Mercedes is quite happy to want to add this to their cake, so we'll let them get on with that. That's an interesting one. And I think you've seen something on the Williams too.
Yeah, I've been looking at all of the cars up and down the pit lane, and we'll give Red Bull a rest for a change, because we've spoken so much about them. The car that's kind of picked up the most details on is, funny enough, is the Williams. Now, we spoke about the Williams a couple of days ago, and I said that it's quite a conventional car, very much the sort of template that everybody's running to with all the sort of key design details, except that they save some money by running last year's gearbox, which still has the pull rod suspension. Looking at the car now, there's lots. The money they've saved from maybe not using this gearbox, they've put into little aerodynamic details, and some of them are quite interesting. I don't think any of them are kind of like the big next thing or something that's really going to change the car's performance, but just shows that they are looking at the car in quite a lot of detail. So at the front, if you look at the front wing end plates, they always have that little curved strake on them, which is part of the 2022 regulations. Now, normally that is literally just a kind of a thin finger thickness of fin going up the side. But what Williams have done is, rather than having it a sort of a thin strake, they've actually made it a, you could kind of cut it in cross section, rather than being like that, it's a V, it's solid. And at the moment, I haven't quite worked out the aerodynamics of why they would do that, because the whole point of having that strake is to create a small vortex which controls the front tire wake. Putting that monolithic shape, as I've been describing it, in would reduce the size of that vortex. But why would you do that? I don't have an answer yet. I'm going to go away and have a think about it. Luckily, in the first day of testing, they had some flow visor in that area, so I can go back and have a look at that now and scratch my head and work that one out. So that's quite interesting. Next thing is the chassis alongside the driver is normally vertical, but Williams have got theirs at a slight angle, which is quite interesting, and that aligns the side of the chassis to the undercut forming around the side pods, which I haven't seen before. And there's also big 4 holes covered up with little stickers on the side of the chassis, suggesting that Williams have got something more to do. Maybe got some bodywork, a bit like we saw with the Mercedes and the Sauber Alfa Romeo last year, where you have kind of downwashing bodywork in the area. It's quite interesting. Nothing we've ever really seen to that extent before. The rest of the car is quite interesting, but the last thing that I want to kind of just draw attention to is the rear wing. If you remember a couple of years ago, when the new regulations came in, Aston Martin found a way of creating an M plate on the rear wing by kind of making these almost like armchair wings sticking up the side of the bodywork there. Now, the FIA moved to ban these by changing the radius regulations in that area. You know, Williams have created a little kind of hump to this area. It's not as big and as extreme as Aston Martin were running a couple of years ago. But what that does do is it helps to kind of keep the pressure above the wing, so that it helps you continue to create downforce, rather than all that pressure then just spilling off down those curved sides of the front wing. And again, it's just showing that they're looking at lots of little areas on this car and finding some developments that other people haven't seen. So I'd be quite keen to see how Williams progress this year, because at the moment, I'm feeling a bit more optimistic about them than perhaps I was when I first saw the car running on the first day of testing.
So, Scarbs, just to wrap up, who's in good shape for next weekend? Who looks to be struggling for next weekend? Have we seen enough running to be able to draw any conclusions?
Well, I mean, I think at the front end of the grid, it's starting to become clear. I think Red Bull have still got a clear advantage. The car is quicker around all of the track, as I've seen from the data I've looked at. Ferrari are looking maybe second fastest at this stage, and we're talking, it's very hard to split, single lap over race performance. We're just talking about kind of raw car performance now. Tyres will come into this a lot more as we get to Bahrain for the Grand Prix itself. Ferrari have got some advantage. They seem to have a much bigger advantage at the end of the straights. So I don't know if that's down to deployment or basically their straight line, their drag that they're running on the car. Equally, Red Bull can choose to run, a whole heap of drag if they know they're going to get pole position. Straight line speed ceases to become important for them. Mercedes are definitely in the ballpark, but potentially a little bit behind Ferrari on raw pace. But again, anything you say here has to come with a whole heap of caveats, but that's the general feel. McLaren are looking really good as well. They've had some issues with their car, which are more on the technical side than the performance side, and that has kind of dragged them out. But you've got to remember, these cars have literally had just 3 days of testing, and some of them, like the Williams, wasn't put together until last week. So you're going to have teething problems. Who then sits behind this midfield pack is just so hard to pick apart. And what we see at Bahrain being, you'd probably describe as a front limited circuit, going on to the other races where you become really limited and you got high speeds and low speeds and all these different changes. I think the midfield will change on a week by week basis, and I don't think there will be anyone standing head and shoulders clear. I think it's sad to say, but I think Haas could perhaps be the back markers in the early part of the season. I think they've admitted that they're going to be in that position. They're going to try and develop themselves out of the rut that they're in. So I think that's kind of where we are. But I think, having said that, I think everyone is squashed up a lot tighter, and there's a lot less scope now for you to kind of get away with errors. So if you have a bad session, if you lose time, certainly if you have any unreliability or tyre problems in the race, there's going to be someone to come and overtake you. I don't think anyone has got any kind of comfort blanket between them and their rivals this year.